All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a seriously fascinating and, yeah, pretty dense constitutional court judgment out of South Africa. It sounds like a dry financial dispute, but it actually exposes the hidden, high-stakes rules of the courtroom game. We're looking at the 2003 case of Norman Murray Ingledew versus the Financial Services Board, and it is the perfect case study of what happens when a citizen's sweeping constitutional rights crash head-on into the strict procedural rules of a trial.
We'll be navigating this legal thriller through 5 quick chapters: the insider trading complaint, the clash of legal rules, bypassing the system, the interests of justice, and finally, the final judgment.
Starting off with Chapter 1, the insider trading complaint.
So this whole dispute escalated incredibly fast. Back in May 2000, the Financial Services Board, the FSB, instituted an action against Norman Murray Ingledew. By mid-2000, he enters an appearance to defend, but right out of the gate, he launches a high court application to get his hands on certain documents. This legal tug-of-war drags on until it reaches the absolute highest court in the land, the Constitutional Court, with a hearing in February 2003 and a final decision dropping in May of that year. But, what actually set this whole chain of events into motion?
Well, as Justice Ngobo perfectly summarized it, the gravamen of the complaint was that they acquired inside information and on the strength of it purchased and sold shares at a profit. Basically, the FSB alleged that Ingledew used his position as a director at a company called Skills Excel to illegally profit from insider info about new directors and a distribution license. But here is the twist. Before Ingledew would even enter his formal plea, like just saying guilty or not guilty, he stopped the clock. He flat out demanded that the state hand over all its documents and interrogation transcripts first.
That bold demand leads us right into Chapter 2, the clash of legal rules.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the specific loophole Ingledew tried to exploit. Under Rule 35.14 of the Uniform Rules of Court, which you can think of as a very narrow specific key, a defendant can ask for documents only if they are strictly required for the purpose of pleading. It's a super limited right. But Ingledew knew this rule wouldn't give him everything he wanted, so he pointed to Section 32 of the South African Constitution. This is a broad universal skeleton key. It guarantees literally every person the general, unqualified right of access to any information held by the state. He claimed this supreme constitutional right totally backed up his demand to see all the files immediately.
Now you might be wondering, wait, how could he just invoke the raw Constitution in a standard trial? Well, he pulled this off because the lawsuit happened during a very specific hiatus period in South African law. You see, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, which is what normally regulates these kinds of requests, had actually been passed by Parliament, but it hadn't come into force just yet. During this tiny specific gap, Ingledew argued he could use the raw text of the Constitution itself as his golden ticket to force the FSB's hand.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, bypassing the system.
So Ingledew basically tried to play a trump card. But here's the thing, you can't just ignore courtroom rules because you found a bigger law. There's this legal principle called the doctrine of objective constitutional invalidity. I know, it sounds incredibly dense, but it's actually pretty simple. If a pre-existing rule, like that narrow Rule 35.14, is inconsistent with the new Constitution, it technically becomes invalid the exact moment the Constitution kicks in. But, and this is absolutely vital, it only functionally goes away once a court formally declares it invalid.
The crucial point here is this: you cannot claim a concurrent right to bypass a courtroom rule without legally attacking the rule itself. Ingledew wanted the sweeping constitutional right to access those files, sure, but he never formally challenged the constitutionality of the narrow court rule he was trying to bypass. As Justice Ngobo pointed out, this was a massive, fatal obstacle. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't try to use the rule, realize it's too narrow for you, and then just jump over to the Constitution without asking the court to strike the rule down first.
And that major procedural misstep brings us to Chapter 4, the interests of justice. Because Ingledew totally bypassed the proper procedure, the Constitutional Court had to step in as a gatekeeper. They applied a really rigorous test. They weren't just looking at whether Ingledew was right or wrong on the law, they looked at the practical reality. Like, what would be the effect on the trial? Would he actually suffer prejudice? At what stage of the high court proceedings? And is this constitutional issue even important enough to resolve right now? They weighed all these specific interests of justice factors to see if stepping in was truly necessary or if it would just entirely derail the trial. This builds into the ultimate logical gotcha moment of the entire explainer. The court asked an incredibly simple practical question. Does the applicant actually need the state's interrogation documents just to plead his case?
Because remember, pleading simply means saying, I'm guilty or I'm not guilty, and laying out your most basic defense.
The court absolutely dismantled his argument here. Justice Nkobo pointed out that the core complaint is about insider trading. He said whether that is so is a matter that is manifestly within his subjective knowledge. Think about it. You really don't need to read a witness transcript to know if you personally traded stocks based on a secret tip. That is something you already know in your own head. Therefore, Ingledew simply didn't need the documents to plead. He wasn't going to be prejudiced. He could just plead right now and then get the documents later during the normal pretrial discovery phase.
Which brings us to our final chapter, the final judgment. With his logical argument completely crumbling, the hammer came down hard. The application was dismissed. The Constitutional Court ruled that this entire multi-year legal adventure was purely dilatory. That is just legal speak for saying it was a massive stalling tactic. It served absolutely no practical purpose, other than to delay the actual insider trading proceedings. Because he'd suffer zero prejudice by pleading without the documents, the court shut the whole application down. But they didn't actually stop there.
Now, courts are generally pretty cautious about punishing citizens who are just asserting their constitutional rights. But here, the court hit Ingledew hard. They ordered him to pay all the legal costs, including the extremely expensive fees for 2 opposing counsel. Why so harsh? Well, it was largely because of how he conducted the litigation. Against explicit court directions to only file the relevant parts of the record, Ingledew unnecessarily dumped the entire massive high court record onto the Constitutional Court's desk. It was a complete abusive process, and the court made him pay for it.
So, it leaves us with this final thought. If absolute constitutional rights could instantly override strict courtroom procedures whenever a defendant wanted, would our justice system actually become a beacon of transparency? Or would trials simply grind to a complete halt, buried under endless demands for information, before a single charge is ever even answered? It's a super delicate balance between our sweeping democratic rights and the practical, everyday rules that hold society systems together. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the rules of the game.